People that love him, heart, mind, soul.
People that love him, heart, mind, and soul. Jesus said something like that, didn't he? And he was quoting? Yeah. Okay. Anything else? He wants, last line on the page, a life of godliness, a life of acting like God. So even though through punishment, God has always said, this is another one of the lessons, God has always said that he is going to preserve a remnant who will be faithful to him. So even when there is the whole nation has turned their back on him, it seems, he's going to do punishment. He's promised this through the book. He's promised there is going to be punishment, but he says, I'm not going to destroy the entire nation. There's going to be a remnant. The remnant is all through history. So we start chapter 7 with two visions of total destruction. Amos says, God showed me a vision. God showed me this. And so two visions showing the same thing. When God shows you one, that's pretty much a done deal, right? When he shows you two, that emphasizes the fact this is going to happen. Or the need for the punishment. The first vision is locust. And we had locust for real back in Joel, right? The details of this are kind of interesting. It says this is going to happen before the second crop. So apparently the king took the entire first crop, and I don't know what their crops were like there. I know growing up on a farm in Missouri, if you were raising alfalfa for a hay crop, there were 3 cuttings for the year. Corn you get 1, soybeans you get 1, wheat you can get 2, but alfalfa you got 3. So apparently the king got the first crop to take care of all the government officials and all the government employees and all the military. So that entire first crop went to taking care of the government. So the people depended on the second crop. Well, the locust plague is getting ready to happen before the second crop, and they're going to destroy everything. And that happens when? Just before the dry season. So if you get your crop and then it goes completely dry, you're not raising crop number 3, are you, while it's dry? No water, you can't raise crop number 3. Pretty elemental thing, right? So if you lose your second crop and you don't get your third crop for a long time, what happens? Starvation. You get hungry, right? So this people that we've been talking about with all this enormous wealth, the houses made of ivory and inlays of this and all this, how long does it take to go without food before things get rough? Not long, right? Because ivory you can't eat ivory, and you can't eat gold, and you can't eat silver. So when there's no food, it gets rough. And so Amos prays and says, please don't do this. Jacob, Israel, is so small they can't handle this, they can't survive it. It doesn't take a lot to reduce. And what does God do? He relents. He says, okay, I'll back off. But second vision comes up, and it's fire. And Amos prays again, and God relents. Do a side note here. So we get the twice confirmed message now in verse 3 and 6, though, that God said, I'm not going to destroy my people. So when God says twice, I'm not going to destroy all my people, we now have a confirmed promise, right? He's not going to confirm all of them. He won't allow it. Now, a side note here on this fire plague is the fire goes through everywhere, right? It goes through the deep ocean, and then it comes up on the land where Israel is, and it's before God relents and pulls it away. Well, what an interesting note about the deep, in pagan culture, there was a creator god, and then there were a couple of other gods that were his enemies. And one of them, Tiamat, dwelt in the deepest part of the ocean, the god of chaos. So we know that Amos is pretty sarcastic, right? He is really quick to jump on something and be sarcastic about it. It would be just like him to take a jab at this, because the fire burns through the deepest part of the ocean, quite a fire. So Amos is probably saying here, could be saying that God is going to burn Tiamat out of his house. Just a side note, thought, we don't know for sure. Then a third vision pops up, and this one is called a plumb line. And this one's different than the first two. Because the first two are about national destruction, national punishment. We're going to just come in and wipe everybody out. This one, I saw God standing by the altar. That's a little bit different tone, isn't it? God is standing by a vertical wall. Now, and he's got what? A thing called a plumb line. Now, Jack knows what a plumb line is, as David probably knows because they're old like me. Who else knows what a plumb line is and what it's used for? We got a couple, several, okay. This is a homemade plumb line. It ain't nothing fancy, is it? It's a string with a weight on the bottom of it. And you know what it does? In 3,000 years, the technology has not increased very much. We now have lasers that will do what this does. But you know what this does? You tack this thing up here on a wall, like that, and you let that weight hold down there, and what does the string do?
Straight line.
It tells you if your line is straight or not straight, and it tells the truth. It does not lie. And so God is standing there with a plumb line against the wall.
Do you know why they call it a plumb line?
Go
Because
ahead.
you're plumb tired of lining that line back up in the
It's all done. String that up about 40 feet worth, yeah, no doubt. Okay. But that is a plumb line, and we still use string today. If we're running a privacy fence or something, we tie a string down here, we tie a string down here, we pull it tight. The string doesn't lie. That's a straight line, horizontal. Do the same thing vertically, it's a straight line.
Also pointing out, the one thing you brought up in I noticed the comments here, he's standing holding the plumb line. That means the person holding that plumb line has got to stand firm.
Firm and perfectly still.
Yes.
But firm, yes. No doubt about it. And so they say, what they're saying here now is the vertical wall represents Israel. Israel was built with a plumb line. When it was built straight. The plumb is the covenant. It was, NIV says built true to plumb. So some of the verses don't get into all that. But then, yeah, Walt says God is standing, he's stationed himself, posture of firmness and determination, the string doesn't lie. God is going to use a standard now and put that plumb line in the middle of Israel and use that standard to judge individuals as well as the nation. A little bit different story here, right? And it's kind of hard to escape that straight line, isn't it? If there's a wobble in your board, the string shows it to you. So it doesn't, and it stands out really quickly, doesn't it? If your line isn't perfectly straight, that string will show it to you. So now Israel had been properly built. What they plumbed, they had been properly built, but now they're out of line, and God knows it. And we don't even have to see the string to know it. The standard is the covenant between them and God, and there is now no more chance for repentance. So where's judgment going to begin? It's going to begin with the places of leadership, or worship, and the leadership of the worship. So it's going to start at the tabernacles, the temples, and it's going to go from there into the social leadership of the king and his house. Why do you start with the leadership? Pardon?
That's where the problem is.
That's where the problem started, isn't it? Okay? People are following a leader. If the people are off base, it's because the leader they're following probably took them there. Okay. So now a couple other things. We've got the law. Did God expect perfection from his people following the law? Did he expect them to be perfect in the way they follow the law?
No.
Of course not. He created us. He knows we're not going to be perfect, right? It was never intended for that. So why did he give them the law with all these rules?
Something to aspire to.
Something to aspire to.
Set them apart.
Set them apart. Leviticus 19:2 says, "You as my people are to be holy." Why? Because I am. If you're going to be my people, you need to act like I act. The law was a way for God to show his people who he was and what he was like. Because he could, self-revelation, he is revealing himself to them all through time, but they can't get a good picture all at one time. So if I don't understand what God thinks about this or believes or what he says about this or this, because I don't, nowhere, interesting note, I just said God thinks. Nowhere in the Old Testament or in the Bible does it say that God thinks anything. God doesn't think anything because God knows everything. We think he knows. So what is it here? God is trying to show them who he is and what he is and where he stands on everything by giving them this set of rules so that they will understand, okay, so I didn't really catch this, but when it comes to morality, he says, oh, I shouldn't lie, okay, because he is true. Okay, so I shouldn't tell a lie. He is this. He is just. He is merciful. I should be merciful. He is this. Oh, okay. Because but since I can't get it by knowing that he is just, because I haven't figured that out yet, but I see that he says I am to be just or I'm to be forgiving, oh, that tells me what he's like. So he gave them this entire set of rules so that they could understand him better and be more like him.
Because there were provisions in the law for atonement.
Yes.
Because he knew they were going to make a mistake. But Paul said the same thing in Romans, the central, like 6, 7, 8 of Romans, that the law is holy, and yes,
Okay.
we're not going to be able to keep it, but
Right. Paul said in Romans, the law is holy, but also the point is he knew from the beginning that people were not going to be perfect, and that's why he gave them the way to get the sacrifices to provide for a way out of those. Okay.
Let me ask you something, Chris.
All right.
I've wrestled with this. I have no problem understanding the Ten Commandments is the way God is. You know, I mean, he didn't just say don't steal because he thought it was a good idea. He says that because that's his way of being.
Mm-hmm.
All the things in the Ten Commandments is the way he is.
Right.
And I understand that. But when you get into like Leviticus and some of these places where you put the blood on the right front toe, what is all that? Why is all that in there? I doubt if he even has a toe.
All right, Lynn.
That's a specific law for the priest, so
Yeah.
there's a lot of very specific laws for the priests, and a lot of it was very symbolic.
Symbolic, yeah. Types and symbols, and why specifics. If you didn't explain it, why does blood cover us from our sins? He never really explains it. He just tells us it's the way it is.
yeah, some of it's just because he said it.
Because I said so. Jamie, did you ever hear that growing up? Jamie, did you ever hear that growing up from your dad? Because I said so?
He still hears it.
Yep, okay. So they're to act like God. Leviticus 19 has a whole list of those in the chapter. And the reason is because I am Yahweh. I want you to do this, this, and this. And the reason I want you to act this way is because I'm God. Back here.
The same provisions he gave us in the Old Testament are the same provisions we have today.
In a different way. We're not offering animal sacrifices, but we have the provisions, exactly. He provided for us just the same, yes, exactly. All right, so the distinctiveness of the people of God was and is to be shown outwardly in their life of obedience. Does that sound like just an Old Testament thing? Or does that sound like a today thing? Our distinctiveness as people of God is to be known by what?
The way we live.
The way we live. You're Christians by your love, specific.
And he said, if you love me, you'll keep my
If you
commandments.
love me, you'll keep my commandments. That's a New Testament thing. So we're not just Old Testament here, are we? We show people that we are God's by acting like God.
Well, the difference also is they dedicated death sacrifices. We are to be living sacrifices.
True. Yep, very good. All right, so the next thing after the law is redemption. The law was God's second element, the second way he revealed himself to the people. The first one was by his redeeming them. Exodus 20, verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That was carrying them out, but the redemption actually was before that. First, he became their redeemer. How did he become their redeemer? It wasn't just by bringing them out of Egypt. How did God redeem his people in the Old Testament? blood of the Passover lamb. So what redeemed them? Blood of an innocent lamb that let the angel pass over their house and punish the people who didn't have it. So blood of the lamb is what redeemed the people. Then he became their lawgiver. Why? Show them the proper pattern of life for a person who was redeemed by God through the blood of the lamb. Again, is this an Old Testament thing or is this a now thing too? Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yes, sir.
Pattern of life for a person who's been redeemed by God through the blood of the capital L lamb. That's us.
It's got, and he made the point that it wasn't your righteousness that caused God to save you.
Right.
In the same way, it's not our righteousness that saves us.
Exactly.
It's-
God repeatedly tells the Old Testament people, and Paul repeatedly tells us, right? It's not because you were so good or so important or so powerful or so numerous that God offered this to you. It's just because he loved you and wanted to give you the chance. Okay. Right there. Because the Lord loved you, kept the oath he swore to your ancestors, and because of that, he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh. Know therefore, remember the therefore, David Clayton's thing, right? That the Lord your God is God, and he is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. Therefore, again, take care to follow the commands, decrees, and laws that I give you today. Why? Because God gave them to you so that you could act like him because he redeemed you. You are now redeemed, therefore, follow these commandments. Okay. So who's the plumb line designed to condemn? Everybody? Everybody who's sinned? Who is it designed to actually condemn?
Those who aren't trying.
Those who aren't trying. They're completely ignoring the heart of the law. They have turned their back. They're actually obeying a good bit of the letter of the law, but the heart is not there at all. And that's why they're perverting justice. They're abusing people. They're going to church on Sunday morning, sitting in the pew, looking at their watch. When 6 o'clock come around so I can open my business back up. And when I open my business back up, what can I do to cheat people? They're in church, right? They're in worship. They're doing what they're supposed to do. They brought their sacrifice. But the whole time, they're thinking of what they can do to be greedy for themselves and to take advantage of other people. So they're ignoring the entire heart of the law of acting a certain way because they've been redeemed and because they're acting like God. So they're ignoring righteousness and justice, not even trying to live like God.
Okay. It's not just condemning, but the plumb line keeps you straight.
Yes.
So it's not just to condemn, but it's also to keep you
Right.
in the right direction.
So if you've got that line out there and your board is crooked, can you straighten it? No. If you see the line and your board's over here and you don't care, it doesn't come back in line, it's not in line, is it? Okay. So verses 10 to 17, we get this little confrontation, and this is about the only storyline.
I was just gonna say, if you've ever tried to put crown molding up,
No.
you know how a wall can look perfectly straight until you start putting crown molding on it. And then you realize how crooked a wall can be. And so, when we're talking about this plumb line, it is the exacting standard, and yet it's so easy to start to stray
Mm-hmm.
and think that you're good and everything's okay.
Yep.
And they obviously thought that they were.
And we talked about this several weeks ago. Satan doesn't care if this is the perfect true north. Does Satan care if you're going this way or this way? You're out of direction either way, right? That's what he wants, because once he's got you here, it's easier to move you this way and further. But as long as you're not pointed here, he's got you off track. That's what he wants, is you to be off track.
That's another thing too. about that. If you're off just a fraction of an inch at the start, 30 feet down the road, you're gonna be several feet off.
You're off, yeah, exactly. And you missed the mark, David.
I heard it illustrated one time, he was talking about that plumb line. If you take that plumb line and you tie it to a tree branch and you let it come down, it doesn't, and it's the true line.
Mhm.
That's what we're to follow.
Right?
It doesn't matter where in that yard you go, that line
It's still straight.
is the same place. You can move closer to it or you can move further away from it, but it never moves, and no matter where you are in life, it's still there, and it still looks the same as it always looked.
Yep. And they do the same thing today with different instruments on it, every construction site you see. They set a point before they ever do anything else, and that point is on a stake, and it stays there until the job's done. And they measure all their elevations and everything else off that one point. Okay. So now we get Amos and Amaziah. Amaziah is their version of like the high priest probably. Amaziah runs off to King Jeroboam and says, Amos is doing all this stuff. And Jeroboam apparently doesn't do much about it. So Amaziah takes it upon himself to come and confront Amos and try and get him to stop. Why? Because apparently Amos is getting a lot of attention. You know, when you come in and you're a sheep herder and you're standing up and you walk up on the stage of a worship assembly and where the priest is supposed to be, and you push him off to the side and you start talking and you start telling people the truth that they don't want to hear, you've got some people's attention, don't you? Okay. So that's what Amos has done. So Amaziah comes back and said, by the way, he takes a little bit of artistic license with his report, it seems like, to Jeroboam. But mostly it's not untrue, but he adds a little bit here and there. Amos had not said that Jeroboam was going to die by the sword. He said the household of Jeroboam. You know, little details, but he's adding little bits here and there. But he orders Amos out of town. You can't say that stuff here. Well, freedom of speech wasn't one of their rights, apparently. so he can't claim that. It's not in their constitution. But what does Amos do in verses 14 and 15? He gives his credentials. He says, I'm not part of a group of prophets, and I'm not part of a guild of prophets that have been raised from kids, up to be prophets. I was doing what I was raised to do down here, herding sheep and doing all this stuff. And what happened? God told me to come. Say, give this message to this people. I didn't choose this. I didn't ask for this. This is what God told me to do. And so you say that I should stop. But God says that I should come here and say this. I'm going to listen to God, not you. Sounds like a New Testament thing, doesn't it? We get some of the apostles right after the resurrection. We told you not to teach. You're filling Jerusalem with all this teaching. Yeah, well, that's because God told us to.
I was just going to say, we have a today example of that with that place kicker from the Kansas City Chiefs. Here, he's a place kicker. He's a football player.
Yeah.
Has to go to a female college, a Catholic college,
Mm-hmm.
and deliver the commencement speech. He gave up and he spoke the truth.
Mm-hmm.
He spoke the truth. And look how much fire and condemnation he came under the last couple of weeks. Even yesterday, there was still news that, and he hasn't backed down. Speaking the truth, speaking God's truth, and bringing a message of hope, and the condemnation that came down from him was just like this.
Yep. There's a book we just the Benedict Option is a book that I highly recommend you read. It's not the only one out there that talks about this, but it talks about us being a post-Christian nation. When most of us were brought up, we were told we lived in a Christian nation. That's not so much true anymore.
I guess my point is that we as children of God are directed to speak the truth. We're commanded to speak the truth. To speak the truth.
Mhm.
And if God places that on your heart, that's what you need to do.
Yep.
But be prepared.
Oh, yeah.
Be prepared, because the devil is going to throw darts at you. He's going to try to make you doubt yourself. He's going to try to twist those things around.
Mhm.
But you need to stick by your guns, and you need to stick by the Scripture.
Yep.
And God will always be there with you. He promises that. He promises that. Don't be afraid, because I'm right there with you.
And he doesn't promise you're going to live through it, though.
No, he doesn't.
Physically.
No.
But he says, I'll be with you.
Yes,
And I still want you to do what's right.
absolutely.
And so, yeah, one of the themes of that book is we are no longer in a Christian nation. We're a post-Christian nation. So when you tell the truth from God's point of view, you're going to get a lot of heat. And that's going to probably get worse over time. So just be prepared for it, but that doesn't mean we stop. So what does Amos say to Amaziah? You personally are going to incur God's wrath. And the nation is still going to get their punishment. So your wife is going to, depending on the version you read, she's going to be raped by soldiers when they come in. Your children are going to die. You're going to be carried off into exile, and you will die on unclean soil. And the nation is going to go into exile. This is what's going to happen. This isn't from me. This is from God through me, because you're standing against God. So, rough, right? All right, chapter 8. Somewhere. There we go. Next vision is a basket of summer fruit. So it says, God showed me a basket of summer fruit and said, Amos, what do you see? And you know how when speakers are talking and they want to make a point, sometimes they'll use rhyming words that don't mean the same thing to make a point. This is what's going on here. So Amos says, I see Qays, case, which means a basket of summer fruit, which symbolizes joy and provision from the harvest. And God says, you know what I see? QES, also pronounced case, almost the same pronunciation in Hebrew. And I see the end of this nation. The time is right. Talking about fruit and ripe, right? Interesting. So God says the end has come. They're going to get theirs. Their hymns of joy are going to be turned into wailing. Corpses are going to be flung everywhere. What's going to happen is so horrific that people will be speechless at seeing it. That's what's going to happen. And then verse 4-6, we get a repeat of the sins that have brought on the judgment. Verse 7, God swears by himself. Verse 8 is the magnitude of the punishment. It's like an earthquake. And if you remember chapter 1, Amos says this was 2 years. Was it before the earthquake? And Amos prophesied for about a year. Could be, and like the flooding and receding of the Nile. When the Nile floods early in the season, it's really high, and then later on it's really low. And that's the magnitude of the punishment is going to be like those things. Verse 9 and 10, he talks about that day, which could be a specific day of calamity, probably is. And he says the sun is going to set and darkness. Most of the commentaries I looked at did not refer to this to anything other than just going to be an interruption of the natural order. It's going to be the darkness is symbolic. The sun is not actually going to hide during the day on this day. But it's interesting, isn't it, that it says it's going to be dark at noon, and the sun will go dark at noon and be brought dark in broad daylight, and there will be mourning as for an only son.
Prophecy.
Nobody claims this is a prophecy. But what happened on the crucifixion? When did the sun go down? Noon. Dark for 3 hours during the middle of the day, and an only son was killed and died. So it doesn't claim a prophecy because it says on that day, and this day is probably not the same day as the crucifixion. But let's call it foreshadowing. Good literary term, right? Because it's very clear, the details. All right. So verses 11 and 14, it says there's going to be a famine of hearing the word of God. And this had happened before. You remember when Samuel was young, right? It says the word from the Lord was very rare. Eli was the priest, and word from the Lord was rare, and visions were not happening. So it wasn't the first time it happened, but we know that really Malachi was the last prophet, and that was 420 to 450 years before the beginning of the New Testament came around. So that 400 years plus with no prophecy, no direct word from the Lord for the nation. He says people are going to stagger from sea to sea. You got a sea over on here, east and west, right? And they're going to stagger from east to north, looking for word from God, and they're not going to get it. So two different interpretations of that. One is they're doing the entire circumference of the country, trying to find it, traveling the entire country and can't find it. Another interpretation is east to west, the two oceans, and the north. But had they gone south, who's to the south? Jerusalem, the city of God. They might have gotten some truth from God and they're going south, but they are not going to. They're staggering around looking for the word of God, but they won't go to where the source is. Just a possibility. Verse 14, he says, you're going to be swearing by these things. Dan is the site of the calf worship that the first Jeroboam had started up. The way of Beersheba. Beersheba is a town actually in Judah. It's a very long pilgrimage. And people would do that pilgrimage, and they thought that having done the pilgrimage would earn them points with God. And so they would swear by the pilgrimage. Well, I did this, so I'm claiming my points from God. And he says that's not what's going to happen. Confidence in anything other than God gains you nothing. And chapter 9, ooh, how are we? Okay, we might get this. Chapter 9, I really like it. Chapter 9 starts out with some symbolism that you have to read a little bit to catch. First Jeroboam had instituted a festival or feast, so he pulled everybody up, in the 10 tribes up to the north, right? They're all in the north, and he doesn't want them going back down to Jerusalem because he's afraid they'll turn their hearts back to God and to the United Kingdom. So what does he do? He sets up a festival. There are 3 main festivals. This one is to appear like the Feast of Booths. The big Feast of Booths happens 15th of the 7th month. So he sets up a festival for the 15th of the 8th month. And it's very much, it's on the 15th day. It's exactly 1 month after the Feast of Booths. And it's like the feast. So he sets it up to be as much like the other one as he can. Sound familiar? And Jeroboam himself officiated at the altar, probably. At least he stood at the altar during the ceremonies. Took the place of the priest while he's at the altar. And why do we know that he stood there? Because in 1 Kings chapter 12 and 1 Kings chapter 13, actually, verse 1, Jeroboam is standing at the altar. And a man of God from Judah comes and confronts him and tells him that he has done wrong and God is going to punish him. See any correlation here? We now have Jeroboam the second king, and we have a man from Judah, this one is named, coming up and putting their sin in front of them. This one is not a vision, but a reality foretold, because you see these other visions, 7:1, 4:7, Amos says, God showed me this. That's a vision. In 9:1, what did he say? I saw. God didn't show me. I saw God standing beside the altar. Not a counterfeit Jeroboam. I saw God standing beside the altar. The temple here, he says, I want the temple, strike the pillars so the temple will fall and it's going to kill those there. Well, if they struck the pillars and knocked the temple down, some people were going to die, but not the nation. This is a figurative speech to talk about the entire nation. We're going to kill a lot of people. He said, and people are going to run. And there's no supernatural place they can go. They can't go to Sheol where the dead people are hanging out. They can't go to the heavens where God's hanging out, because I will find them. There's no natural refuge. The bottoms of the sea, if they go to the bottom of the sea where that Tiamat, I will find them. And the serpent, I'll use the serpent that's down there to bite them. So if there's something down there, if there's anything down there, I control it. So they can't get away from me there. If they go into exile, their captors can't protect them either. I'm going to send a sword after them and kill them wherever they go. There is no way to get away from you. This is what God is saying. No way. Verse 5 and 6, he talks about the omnipotence of God. This is probably from a hymn of the time. And he talks about the effect of the earth when God descends. God says, I touch it, and the earth shakes. And we get into some of the different things. God's power is shown in the creation. So verse 7 and 8, it almost sounds like God is withdrawing the covenant, isn't it? Is he? He's talking now to Israel. Are you not to me as the sons of Ethiopia, you sons of Israel, declares the Lord? Have I not brought up Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Ker? Behold, so God's saying, you're no better than all these other people that you despise. Right? So is he withdrawing the covenant? Say no. But he's saying, guess what? Those Ethiopians that you think are a very distant, weak, and insignificant people, you're no better than they are. There's nothing more special about you than them other than the fact that I chose you. And if you choose to neglect and reject me, then there's nothing there, right? What about the other? The Israelites thought that being brought out of Egypt made them special. They weren't going back to the Passover. They were going to the Red Sea and the passing through the Red Sea. And that made them special, the fact that God helped them with their migration. And God says, guess what? That migration of the Philistines from here to here and the other people from here to here, I did that one too. I'm responsible for when a nation picks up and moves, I did it. So when you move from Egypt to here, I did it. But I did it for these people and these people too. Why? Because I said. Right? God's got a plan. We don't have all the details, but he's got the plan. Okay. So God's responsible for all of that. Not just for the Exodus, but for every national migration. Verse 8a, he says, I'm watching the sinful kingdom in my version, but it probably means any sinful kingdom because he says, I will punish. And he's going to punish all who are sinful, who are not under grace, isn't he? Okay. 8b, the second half, he reaffirms that he is not going to completely destroy Israel ever. All right. Verse 9, he talks about a sieve. I didn't bring one, Jack. I couldn't find one this morning. Anybody still got a sifter in their kitchen? I don't think we do. Oh, she said we do. I just didn't ask. Okay. Ever use a sieve? Anybody? What's a sieve do?
Separates the, it allows what you want to fall through and keeps what you don't want.
So it's basically a bowl or a cone with holes in it. And you put stuff in it and you shake it. And the small stuff goes through and the big stuff stays in it. So you've separated the small from the big, the good from the junk, whichever one is which, and you can separate them and keep them apart now. So God says, I'm going to shake the nation like it's in a sieve. We're going to go through a testing. And we're going to find out what comes out on the other side. You eliminate impurities, large objects. So he says in this case, pebbles are going to stay inside the sieve because they're big, the rocks are, and the dirt is going to go through. All the good stuff is going to go through and land on the ground. We can plant in it. The rocks are going to stay in it, and we can take them and throw them out. The people that are the sinners are the ones that deny that there is a God, and they will die. They're the arrogant who deny the judgment of God. Type of. They're either so arrogant that they believe God is not going to judge them. And we had Jews here and in Romans 1 and 2 say that God's not going to judge us. We can do whatever we want because we're God's people. He's not going to punish us. And here Amos and in Romans Paul says, So now, I like this question. Are you smarter than a commentator? Verses 11 through 15. Verse 11 and 12 says, on that day, the sifting is going to begin. Most of my commentaries say that they probably began with the exile and continued through the Christian age. That makes sense? The sifting, a nation's going to come in and take you captive, and then you're going to be in captivity for a while. This is when the sifting begins, but it is going to continue on, right? And then he says, I'm going to raise up the fallen shelter of David. The Davidic dynasty, the kingdom of David, had suffered greatly. You've got the split kingdom now, so you've got 2 tribes here and 10 tribes here. You've got all this stuff going on, military attacks, spiritual decline. So David's dynasty has declined a lot. So God says, I'm going to restore it. And that is foretold as continuing through the Messiah. So what is God able to do here in verse 12 with David's kingdom and with our lives? He's able to raise up the fallen shelter, wall up its chaos, raise up its ruins, and rebuild it. He can do that with it. He's going to do it with an entire dynasty, an entire kingdom. Can he do it in your life? Okay. So what's the symbolism? Verse 12 says of Edom, it says they're going to possess Edom. Well, Edom had been the nation that was the closest kin to Israel. Also, the biggest thorn in the side, the biggest pain in the rear throughout most of their history. So, but what's the symbolism? Edom is used by the prophets to mean the entire history, hostility of the world to the kingdom of God. Now, it speaks now of the presence of the power of the new King David that's coming. The first David is the only king that had ever completely dominated, conquered, and held Edom. The first David is the only king that had ever done that. The second David, the Messiah, is going to do it also. But now we have the word possess. We'll come back to that. So when Edom falls and is conquered, that is, we're foretelling here, all worldly opposition is clearly and finally ended, and the second and greater David, the Messiah, will have arrived. Possess, the Edom in verse 12, isn't necessarily a physical conquering, it is an incorporating. So this other nation that had been hostile to God is now going to be incorporated into Israel because the Messiah has come. It says all nations who are called by my name, not just for physical Israel anymore, but for everyone. There's some verses you can look up because we're running out of time, but we're going to finish this. This is fulfilled in the offspring of David, who is Jesus, thank you. Now, verse 11 says, on that day, when is that? Well, it started with the exile, and it goes through the Christian age on earth, right? That's what we just said. Verse 12 is what? There's not a period at the end of verse 11, there's a semicolon. Verse 12 is a continuation of the sentence from verse 11. It says, when the Messiah has come. So that tells us that on that day goes through the time of the Messiah coming. All right. Verse 13 then says days are coming. If the day in 11 involves the coming of the Messiah, does it not stand to reason that the days in verse 13 would come after the day in 11? That make sense? Okay. Has anything remotely close to this, let's do this. This has to be read. Days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman will overtake the reaper. So while I'm out here trying to gather in the crop, the guy coming with the next crop is already catching up with me because my crop is so big, I can't pull it fast enough. Okay? And the one who treads grapes is going to overtake the one that's sowing the seed. Same thing. The mountains are going to drip grape juice. The hills will come apart, just like it said in Joel chapter 3. I will also restore the fortunes of my people Israel. They will rebuild the desolated cities and live in them. They will also plant vineyards, drink their wine, make their gardens, and eat their fruit. I also will plant them on their land, and they will not be uprooted again from their land which I have given them, says the Lord your God. Powerful, right? Has anything like that ever happened on earth since the exile? For any nation? No. Not literally. How about figuratively? Has Israel been so rich spiritually that they could claim this as a prophecy fulfilled? No. Okay. Such fertile abundance has never occurred on earth except for during the Garden of Eden. Verse 14 is a reverse of chapter 5:11, where you're gonna sow your seed, you're gonna build your house, but you can't live in it. Now he says you're going to rebuild your house and you're going to live in it, so the people are going to be able to enjoy the fruit of their labor. Now then, having looked at verse 12, my people Israel, who are called by my name, who's Israel in verse 14? Physical Israel? Spiritual Israel? Spiritual Israel. Thank you. Because my people who are called by my name is no longer just the nation of Israel. It is everybody that calls on the name of the Lord and accepts Jesus as their Messiah. That's who we have in verse 14. Verse 15, how long will this last? Forever. The penalty of sin has been removed forever. When will sin's presence, power, and penalty be permanently removed? I did not mean to put that much alliteration in there. When is the power of sin, the presence of sin, the punishment of sin going to be removed forever? Last days, call it heaven. When will abundance, satisfaction, and security be permanent? Heaven. Remember, this is a promise from God and not just a vision. God says, I am going to do this, and I will not change my mind. So are you smarter than a commentator? Because I have between 10 and 12 commentaries, and not one of them said that this is end time. And I may not be right, but I didn't get recorded, so you can't prove me. But tell me that this is not an end time prophecy. Put that all together, you've got your notes, tell me that's not an end time prophecy of what's going to happen in the final days. Now then, if you agree with that, in my opinion, you're smarter than 10 or 12 different commentators. All right. So God is committed to raise up the eternal kingdom. God has promised to restore the fortunes of his people. God has promised to plant his people with eternal security in their inheritance. Amos begins the book with the words of Amos. How does he end it? He says, the Lord your God. God said, this is what I'm going to do. Amos, who's been very pessimistic, very sarcastic all through, this last half of the last chapter turns into a very, we got some good news coming, right? All right.